Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Carvizzi. Now, in this segment, we're going to discuss a new bill that is in the UK that may very well pass quite soon. It has already seemingly passed, I believe, its first hurdle. This bill seemingly, according to critics and according to 150 organizations who have warned UK ministers, seems to want to curb protests, peaceful protests, that is. We're not talking about violent protests, we're talking about non-violent protests. This all, of course, comes in the wake of the death of a woman in the UK and a protest that had taken place soon after her death and after her body had been found, and the fact that a policeman was then charged with her killing. This could not be worse timing for, of course, the Johnson government. Nevertheless, within this entire bill, there is no protection for women to begin with, but secondly, it is quite wide-ranging as well. So it doesn't only affect, of course, such a protest as that took place after the killing of Sarah, but would in fact cover all other protests, such as Black Lives Matter, especially the likes of Extinction Rebellion. Priti Patel, as well as the other police officials, have also said they need further powers to be able to stop protests, which essentially create an annoyance and disturbance for businesses or otherwise, and people going about their daily lives, be it in central London or otherwise. Of course, I'm paraphrasing a lot of the bill's details there. Let's discuss all of this a bit further. We're now joined by Chris Daw, who is a criminal barrister, legal commentator, and author of Justice on Trial. He is joining us today from London. Also joining us from the British capital today is Samir Pasha, who is a lawyer and barrister. Samir and Chris, thank you both for taking your time out this morning. Samir, let me start with you. How concerning is this? Is this, as the many human rights organizations have called, an attack on the fundamental rights of UK citizens?
Yes. So in a nutshell, yes, it is an attack on fundamental rights. It's completely draconian. It's unnecessary. A lot of the powers that they are describing and that they want to bring in already exist in some form in legislation. Also, the fact is that it's going to make it very difficult for a country like the UK to talk about protests in other countries where they're being put down by, very heavy-handed governments, when we are essentially going to be doing the same with this bill.
Indeed, and that's what one wonders, Chris. At this point, does the UK really need this as well? Because, Patel and police officials believe that they do.
Let's call this what it is. It's a massive power grab by central government, by the Home Secretary Priti Patel, and by the Prime Minister Boris Johnson, so that the Home Secretary going forward, if this legislation comes into force, which it looks likely that it will, the Home Secretary will have the power to decide which demonstrations, which protests should be designated as dangerous in some way to the public order or to the safety of the community, and the police, with the Home Secretary's permission, can go in and break up a demonstration using these new powers. So for the very first time in this country, we are going to see the Home Secretary and the police deciding when protest is legitimate, when the cause is one that should be allowed to be protested, and when it should be banned. And that is a complete break with tradition in the British Constitution, unwritten as it is, that we as British people are allowed to protest on the streets, and we're not to be told by the government when we can do so.
As if that wasn't bad enough, right, Samir, about when you cannot protest. And there's also a segment about monuments and otherwise. And of course, that's an ode to the Black Lives Matter protests, which have taken place in the UK as well. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's actually quite funny in a sense, because when I was reading the bill and when I was reading the comments and reactions from politicians, the government stated that actually, we've done quite a lot in this bill to, protect women and vulnerable women and stuff. Actually, it turns out that, any crime against, inflicting damage on a monument could, theoretically lead to a prison sentence up to 10 years, which could be more than a sexual assault matter or even rape in some cases. So I find this whole kind of, attack on monuments and having to bring in a special section on that, quite unnecessary again, because, well, we have, acts such as the Criminal Damage Act, which would cover that. We have public order acts which cover issues such as this. So the fact is that it's not very necessary. What it essentially is that, it's an annoyance bill. And I call it an annoyance bill because it's designed to stop the kind of annoyance that some people feel when protests occur. And as a result, like Chris was saying, that it's brought on a lot more power to the police to use their discretion, which they already have quite a lot of, and the Home Office to determine when, the annoyance limit has been crossed.
So, Chris, what is this an attempt to do? I mean, certainly the government knows it cannot shut down protests, right? I mean, that's the right of everybody within any free society, as the UK would claim it is. So, I mean, what is the goal here specifically? Because public nuisance, as we know, of course, is very vague language.
This is a political bill. This is not a bill that is based genuinely around the need to maintain public order and to protect the public from dangerous individuals. This is absolutely a political bill. And take the example that Samir mentioned of the amendment to the legislation around defacement of monuments. This is a direct attack on Black Lives Matter because Priti Patel has described Black Lives Matter as dangerous and described many of the environmental protests that we've seen as being, inappropriate and something that should be cracked down on. And so this is exactly a bill to bring in the government's political agenda to attack those with which the government disagrees. And so you're absolutely right to say that we as British people have historically had a right to protest. This is a very dangerous attempt by a power-hungry government to remove from the streets of Britain the sorts of protests that you're showing on your screen right now. And in particular, one of the most offensive things of all here is the government has stepped in to protect statues of slave traders, which were being damaged in some cases by Black Lives Matter protesters, unsurprisingly perhaps given the history of slavery in this country and around the world. And the government has chosen, of all the issues, to bring in 10-year sentences for defacing the statues of slave traders, whilst rapists often walk away with sentences of half that. It's a disgusting, it's a disgraceful piece of legislation, and let's just hope that, sadly, we have to rely on the House of Lords to step in, we hope, to protect some of these rights that the House of Commons and the government are trying to take away.
Right, Samir, but if I may just play devil's advocate for a moment, the government says, and I'm going to quote the Home Office directly now, it said that the freedom of expression would not be undermined by this bill, that the majority of protests in England and Wales are lawful and will be unaffected by these changes. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't. I was a legal observer last year at the Black Lives Matters protests, and so I was on the ground at most of these protests, keeping an eye on the police. And the fact is that I've had to represent some clients who were, arrested for merely being present at the protest, maybe because they weren't.
All right, it seems we've lost Samir there. Let me go to you, Chris, with that same question then. Do you think that the government, in this case, when it says, listen, we're not going to be blocking the majority of protests, that it's right?
Well, they're right. They won't block the majority of protests. They won't block fox hunting protests from Conservative supporters. They won't block Brexit supporting protesters. They'll only block the protesters they disagree with. So the majority of protests that they're not interested in or that accord broadly with the government's viewpoint won't be affected. But what we're seeing here is that the level of power given to the police and the authorities is greater than any power ever taken by central government in the United Kingdom over public protest. And so what we're seeing, for example, is that even if a single member of the public may be, quote, inconvenienced by a demonstration or a single business disrupted by a demonstration, the police can step in and prevent it. And in particular, there are severe restrictions on the right to protest in and around Parliament. So you would think that one of the many purposes of public protest, but probably the most central one, is to alert other people, whether they are members of the public, whether they are politicians, to the issue. And what the government is looking to do is shut down that protest, take it away from Parliament, move it it away from the earshot of politicians, move it away from the earshot of members of the public. So you'll end up with protesters having to protest on their own somewhere privately where the government disagrees with the issue that they're protesting about. And these powers, once they've been given to the government, let's get real, what happens around the world, a government takes power away from the people, they're not going to give it back again.
And Samir, you were talking there about people you've had to represent from the Black Lives Matter protests. I mean, if, for example, this does pass, how much harder does this make life for those like yourself who then have to represent people who come out and protest for issues, of course, that are legitimate?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to make life a bit more difficult in the sense that we would have to make a lot more representations towards the police. We'll have to make a lot more representations in court, and we're going to have to, continue kind of, challenging the discretion that the police have applied or would have applied when they decided that they wanted to arrest somebody that fell within this statute. I was saying before, I've represented, some clients who were arrested at the Black Lives Matter protest. And essentially what happened is, we had a client who had, no criminal record whatsoever, completely clean record. And because he was arrested at one protest outside the US Embassy, the police decided, in all of their infinite wisdom, to impose a bail condition where he would be banned from attending any protest, whether it's Black Lives Matter or any other protest. And that gives you a glimpse into how heavy-handed the police can get when they want to really stamp down on somebody exercising their right. And, we put forward representations that how can you stop somebody exercising their fundamental right to protest, when you are banning them from attending any protest. It's just completely disproportionate, much like this bill is. So I'm not surprised, but it's going to make life a lot more difficult, mostly, and mainly for the clients.
Okay, so Chris, as an final word then before I let both of you go, why isn't there more uproar about this? I mean, yes, I know that there are a lot of people who are very, very worried, but do you think it's because people are distracted with the pandemic and Brexit and all of the above that there isn't more uproar, or do you think that there is enough uproar? I mean, I feel like this isn't a big enough issue, hasn't been made of this as it should be.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that there is a significant amount of uproar about this. There have been some public protests about this legislation. But sadly, the government came to power in December of 2019 and won a big majority with Priti Patel promising just this sort of legislation, talking about cracking down on certain individuals and certain types of demonstration, talking about increasing prison sentences for a whole range of crimes, talking about giving the police more and more powers. I'm not sure the police even want these powers. I mean, the thing that I'm really concerned about here is, police officers in this country, in Britain, have always policed by consent. And once you place the police in direct opposition and physical and violent opposition to members of the public going about their lawful business and exercising their lawful right to protest, it creates a dangerous precedent for the relationship of the public with the police. And so that's very concerning. But to answer your central question, I think we are seeing the government try to smuggle this legislation through under the COVID pandemic umbrella. Because we already have all of these restrictions. We've had so many of our rights taken away over the last 12 months, and the government are trying to sneak this through at a time when the public are looking the other way and thinking about something else.
Yeah, very well. We'll leave it there at that, but we sincerely appreciate both Chris and Samir for taking their time out of their busy schedules to share their insight with us. We were discussing there this is essentially anti-protest bill, if we're completely honest, and that is how it should be termed. What kind of example will this set then for the rest of the world, right? As our guests are mentioned, I mean, you lose moral authority then as a country if then you point to others and say, hey, you can't crack down on protests, but we can, with this kind of legislation that is set to be passed by all means, seemingly, by the UK government right now, targeting Black Lives Matter, whoever it does target, but it's wide-ranging enough that it can essentially be used against any protest that the government or police deem are inconvenient or a public nuisance. I mean, those are such vague words that really you can use this to any political means and to any political end that you so wish, depending on who is in power. And that in and of itself goes against the entire grain of what the purpose of peaceful protests are. I'll be back with my final segment after this break.